Back to the Watchman's Whole Word Bible Study with me, Donovan, and we finished last time chapters 11 and 12. So we're moving forward today in the book of Genesis to chapter 13. And in chapter 12, we saw Abram getting outside the will of God due to a famine in the land of Canaan where God had brought him. And Abraham gets into his flesh. He sees the hunger around him. He begins to get worried. And he starts to act in his own will, and he decides he's going to go to the breadbasket, Egypt, and he's going to go there and get some relief from the famine. He's going to take his wife, he's going to take his cousin Lot and all their possessions, and we see that the Egyptians, it's a wicked pagan nation, and they have a thing where strangers who come into the land are not treated well. So they are oftentimes set upon, men killed, and women taken and put into harems, sold into slavery, this kind of thing, women and children. So he is afraid that that's going to happen to his wife Sarai. So he tells her to lie and say that she's his sister. She does so. You got to wonder if he really loves his wife or if she's just another one of his possessions. So she does tell a lie, and exactly what he was afraid of happens to him. All of this because he was not in the will of God. It's not as if God told him to go into the land of Canaan from the land of his origin, Ur. It's not like God would say, leave Ur and go to Canaan so you can starve to death with your wife, your family, and all your cattle. God obviously had a plan to take care of Abram through the famine, but Abram didn't want to wait, and it doesn't sound like he even asked. He's a bright man, he's a self-willed man, and we see again, righteousness is not an act of the will. It's not an act of the flesh. If you're acting in your own will, if you're acting in your flesh, you're not righteous at all. You're self-righteous, and your righteousness is nothing. And Abram here is self-righteous. He just decides on his own, independent of any God. He doesn't even consult God. He behaves rather godlessly, and he goes into Egypt, and something bad happens to him. Well, the Lord steps in. He has plans for Sarai. He has plans for Abram in this marriage to build a nation from their offspring. So he directly intervenes, and he afflicts Pharaoh's household where Sarai has been taken into Pharaoh's harem. He afflicts that household, and notice that even though they're a pagan society, they still are close enough to the revelation of God. Here we're about 700 years out from the flood of Noah, so they're close enough that Pharaoh realizes, hey, this is the work of the Almighty. This is the work of a God who's greater than the gods of Egypt. And he gets upset and he throws Abram out of Egypt. And Abram has accumulated things in Egypt just by the largesse of the Pharaoh. And Pharaoh doesn't even want the things back. He just wants Abram and all of his stuff to go. So he ejects him out of the country. And we're going to see this repeated in Exodus when God brings the 10 judgments upon Egypt. By the end of it, after the firstborn male are killed in the Passover, at that point the Egyptians are so afflicted that they give the Israelis anything they want and just say, get out of our country. They just eject them. And so we're going to see this, what happens here with Abram, we're going to see that replicated. So that brings us to chapter 13 of Genesis, verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all he had, and Lot, his nephew, with him, into the Negev. I sometimes call Lot Abram's cousin. I'm not sure why that is. He is actually his nephew. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. So you see, he ends up back where he never should have left anyway. That's the lesson here, is that he did all of this really almost for nothing. And if it wasn't for the intervention of the Lord, his wife would be nothing more than a prostitute in some stranger's harem, and he would be in the grave. So that's the lesson here. And then he goes through all this, and he ends up back in the land that God wanted him to be in, and there's the famine, and it doesn't sound like he's starving. So there was no point in him getting outside the will of God. But you see, we're so deaf to the things of the Spirit that even righteous people, even people who call on the name of God, our flesh, it's so powerful and it never stops calling. So Abram is just in his flesh. He just did what he willed himself to do, and now he's come full circle. So it's almost like a step back. It is a step back in his walk with God. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. So we see here, again, like Eve, Lot doesn't consult with God. He looks and he sees that with his eyes, he looks just through his flesh, and he sees that the land is good. But we're going to see here, the land that he chooses includes two cities that are already on God's radar, and that God is going to use as an example of the wickedness of man and the holiness of God and the judgment of God. And those cities are Sodom and Gomorrah. And Lot, because he doesn't consult with God, he's not really living he's living in the flesh. He does what his flesh desires him to do, and he chooses. He doesn't look and say, "Hey, the people in Sodom and Gomorrah are desperately wicked." I mean, he wants to live in a place that's cosmopolitan. You see, he is thinking about Egypt, and Egypt is a symbol of the world, and he wants to live in the world. So he goes down. He wants the land that is like as close to Egypt as he can get. So he chooses the lesser part, but in his natural mind, it looks like he's the winner here. So he doesn't defer and say, "Hey, Abram, why don't you go and take that land that has Sodom in it?" He won't. He sees, hey, it has great grazing, good food, there's lots of parties, the cities are big, everybody's living it up down there. I'm going to go this way, and you go out there to the wilderness where there's nothing, and you struggle to find water and a good time. Me and my wife, we're going to go and be a part of the high life. So he goes that way. Thus they settled from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him. Now God's got Abram alone, and we're going to see this again and again, that God gets Abram alone. He gets Abram alone, and now he has something to tell him. Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. So these are nomadic people. This is what they did in the land of Ur, so they're doing the same thing. They live in tents, and they will pasture on a certain piece of land with their herds, and then when it's depleted, they will move on. And they kind of follow the good pasture, they follow the good water, and they move quite often. So God tells him, do what you normally do, walk through this land, and see how good it is, because it's yours. And when we get to Revelation, we'll see how this is going to be completed in the Lord, based on the faithfulness of the Lord. In a couple chapters, we're going to see the covenant that God makes with Abram. In chapter 15, I believe, we're going to see the covenant that God makes with Abram, and how he makes the covenant with Abram, but he bases the commitment only on God. God bases the commitment only on himself. He doesn't base the commitment on Abram and his flesh, because we're going to see how Abram falls into his flesh quite often, and his flesh is quite strong, like all of ours, and he is oftentimes outside the will of God, and God doesn't want he won't accept our flesh, because it's corrupt, and everything that we do in our flesh, it's wrong. And so God doesn't include Abram's flesh. He makes a spiritual covenant with Abram that cannot fail, because it's done in the Spirit of Christ. So we're going to see that in the next couple of chapters. That brings us to chapter 14, and we'll go on with chapter 14 and 15 in our next study. Until then, keep heeding the call. Try to live your faith, stay faithful, wait for the Lord. Seek the Lord in all your counsel. Ignore the counsel of man if you can. And if you can't, take it to the Lord. Take it to the Lord and wait and see what he has to say about the counsel you're getting. And I don't care if that counsel is from a woman you've been married to for 35 years, or your parents who have raised you, or your friends who you've known since the 3rd grade. It just doesn't make a difference. The counsel of man is the counsel of flesh, it's the counsel of the world, it's our experiences in this world. And unless that person is praying and is praying with you, their counsel is probably from the flesh, and if it's from the flesh, it's corrupt and it's wrong, and you shouldn't take it. And God will often correct you if you give him a chance. So we're going to see this happen with Abram, and his very own wife gives him ill counsel. So keep heeding the call, and keep yourself in the love of Christ. Until next time, folks, take care.